What's going on, guys? Welcome back to my channel, where today we have a Stardom Situm quarterback edition for week 2. But first, we're going to go over something a little bit new for this channel with this series, and I'm going to show you that to you right now. And that's going to be this. Now, what I did is I took all of my picks that I made in week 1, I took their stats and put them up against each other in terms of the top 16 quarterbacks. Obviously, I didn't include the Thursday and Friday games because, they were out before I made the video, so did not include them. But top 16, if they were in the top 16 and I said that they were a start, obviously they get a green. If they weren't, or if I said to start and they weren't successful, they get a red, and vice versa. If I said to sit them and they did well, red, and so on and so forth. So obviously Josh Allen did very well. But then I had guys like Derek Carr and Geno Smith that did very well, and I told you to sit them. That's on me. So I'm going to do this from now on to hold myself accountable. You can see here 18-9 over week 1, about a 66% hit rate. Did not include Russell Wilson because he didn't play, and I'm not going to include Justin Fields' stats despite saying, sit him. I'm not going to take credit for that. But if you guys like this and you want to see more of this, make sure you let me know in the comments below, but let's get right into the video. Alright, so first up we have the Thursday night game, and we're going to start with the quarterback from the visiting team, Josh Allen. Obviously, we're going to go ahead and start Josh Allen. He was number 1 in fantasy as the quarterback for 3 of the last 4 seasons. Last season, he scored 36 and 24 points versus the Dolphins, so he has some pretty good statistical showings versus them. He is number 1 fantasy points per game in 2023, had over 24 fantasy points per game, number 1 in rush TDs for quarterbacks. He's getting it done both in the air and on the ground, and it's showing in his points. The Dolphins did allow 20th in points for quarterbacks, but Josh Allen, he's Josh Allen. He was number 2 in fantasy points per dropback. He scored 31 points last week. If you're thinking about sitting him, I think you should really consider thinking again. He's starting in every format, anything. If you have him, start him. Now, up next, we have the home quarterback for that game. And this might come as a shock, but I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sit Tua. Now, there are a couple of reasons for this. The main focus being Tua does not play very well against the Bills. He scored 14 and 9 points versus the Bills in 2023. The Bills also held Kyler to 14 points in week 1, and that was including, some yardage on the ground, which Tua does not have. He did lead the league in passing yards in 2023, but was only 16th in fantasy points per game. So leading the league in passing yards doesn't exactly correspond to fantasy value. He is tied for 4th most interceptions in the NFL in 2023. He had 3 of them against Buffalo. So he's turning the ball over against Buffalo and, not scoring that many points. He had 10 games of QB 16 or worse in 2023, and his best games were against very bad teams in the Giants, Carolina, Las Vegas, Washington. I think you get it. He doesn't play well against good defenses. He shows that time and time again. And for that, I'm just not going to want to sit him. I don't see this working out well for him. Now, up next, we have my GOAT, as you can see, Brock Purdy. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start him versus the Vikings here. He was the QB 6 in 2023, 11 finishes of QB 14 or better, 7 finishes of that in the top 10. He had the 3rd most passing touchdowns. He was 1st in yards per attempt, 3rd in fantasy points per dropback, 1st in deep ball completion percentage. The Vikings last year tied for 10th least interceptions in 2023. They also allowed the 10th most passing yards and were tied for the 12th most passing touchdowns allowed. I don't think their defense got any better. They lost Danielle Hunter. And, the 49ers are riding a wave. They're a very, very good football team. They have a lot of outs. With Christian McCaffrey probably not going to play in this game again. think that they're going to probably have to rely a little bit more on Brock Purdy. They're still getting warmed up. He didn't have to throw the ball at all last week because Jordan Mason was kind of carrying the load. I expect him to have to do that a little bit more, get the ball out to his playmakers like Debo, like Brandon Ayuk, finally find them. And, I think he's going to really be successful. I would absolutely start Brock Purdy this week. All right, now this next one should come as no surprise. Sam Darnold versus the 49ers. We're going to go ahead and sit Sam Darnold easily here. The 49ers only allowed 9.6 points to Aaron Rodgers in week 1, and that Jets team is significantly better than the Vikings, in my opinion. 49ers also allowed 22 interceptions. That was tied for the most in the NFL with the Bears. They allowed the 8th least passing touchdowns to quarterbacks in 2023 and allowed an average of 9.7 fantasy points to quarterback in 2023. Along with this, they only allowed over 16 points to quarterbacks 5 times last season. Sam Darnold is not that guy. I'm sorry. If he is that guy, I'll eat my words, but he is not that guy. He won't be that guy this week. Justin Jefferson can only do so much. The Vikings don't have that many offensive weapons to work with. Jordan Addison is not looking likely to play. I'm going to go ahead and sit him. It's not going to be his week. Up next, we have Geno Smith versus the Patriots, and we're going to go ahead and sit him this week. Now, I really thought about starting him, but there are a couple of reasons why I decided not to. The Patriots defense actually, despite what I said last week, is still looking like that same stingy Patriots defense that we've all known and we've all hated for so long. They don't really look like they missed a step. They only allowed 8.06 points to Joe Burrow last week. Joe Burrow's on a significantly better team with a significantly better offense. And the Patriots were really playing to, keep him out of the end zone. I think that they're going to do the same with Geno this year in this game. He was bad last year, and, an 18-point performance against a very mediocre defense last year is not going to change that. He's going to have to show me a lot more compared to his 23rd in fantasy points per dropback last year. He ranked 20th in fantasy points per game. The Patriots also allowed tied for the 4th least amount of touchdowns to quarterbacks in 2023 and allowed 0 to Joe Burrow in week 1. They had the 8th least points per game to quarterback in 2023 and allowed the 10th least passing yards in 2023. Like I said, Mayo is not Belichick, but he did learn under Belichick, and that's something that I should have realized last week. But it's just better to stay away from Geno. I don't know why, but everybody always just, dies against the Patriots as a quarterback. They hold their own very well despite not, showing many points or many wins on that scoreboard as of late. It's just better for you if you stay away from him at this point. And that's going to be the same thing for Jacoby Brissett. Jacoby Brissett did not show me anything last week that says that he warrants any sort of start. He's just kind of a filler that's teaching Drake May and Joe Milton how to run things before obviously handing off the reins to them either later this season if they're really that bad or sometime next season. So he's not going to be a fantasy viable quarterback, I think, in probably 90% of weeks. The Seahawks allowed 11 points to Bo Nix in week 1, and that was with a rushing touchdown. So they did very well, but again, the Broncos are not a very good team. They've still got a lot of things to figure out, but the Patriots might have the worst passing offense in the entire NFL. They also might have the worst wide receiver core in the entire NFL. They were the 5th worst passing offense in 2023. They threw the 6th least passing touchdowns in 2023 between their 2 starters with a total of 16, and they threw a total of 21 interceptions in 2023, which was tied for the 2nd most. This is a team that's rebuilding. They need to figure a lot of things out. If you're thinking about starting Jacoby Brissett, you should probably look at the waiver wire and hope that somebody else is there because he's not going to get it done for you. Yes, up next we have everybody's favorite quarterback, Daniel Jones, in the Giants going against the Commanders. This is the most obvious sit for me of the week. Daniel Jones has not been good for a while. He had that one season where he was fantasy viable and a decent quarterback, and he's just kind of crapped the bed since then. He had under 5 points last week. They were the second worst passing offense in 2023, and it doesn't look like they're getting any better. Over the last 5 games for Daniel Jones, he has 0 touchdowns and 5 interceptions. He's averaged 5.9 fantasy points in those games, and Washington's defense, I know, is really bad, but Daniel Jones might actually be worse. This guy's getting paid $40 million a year, and he's doing nothing with it. It's only a matter of time before they probably bench him for Tommy DeVito again, or pick up somebody else and trade for somebody else. Go in the draft, get somebody, but he's not good. Don't start him. On the other hand, though, we have this guy, Mr. Jaden Daniels, going up against the Giants. And, the Washington Commanders played bad last week. Their defense played horrible. They lost, pretty badly. It was a pretty one-sided game, I felt like, for the most part. But, he did the most with what he got. He scored 26.16 points in week 1 on 88 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns. He got it done with his legs. We all knew that was the biggest asset of his game when it came to fantasy. It wasn't going to be his passing yards or anything like that. It was going to be what he can do with his legs. I do expect his passing numbers to be better this week and his running numbers probably to be a little worse. What he didn't do last week through the air, like I said, he did on the ground. And the Giants are one of 8 teams that allowed 2 or more passing touchdowns in week 1. They're just a bad team. I think Daniels builds on what he set up last week. I think he proves himself to be a top 16 quarterback this week, and probably for most of the remainder of the season. I'm sure he has some off weeks. He is a rookie. He is still learning, but he's going to be a very good fantasy quarterback for us. We're going to go ahead and punch in the start. Chargers at Panthers up next, and Justin Herbert is a very interesting one. I'm going to go ahead and rule a sit here. I know that Derek Carr threw for 3 touchdowns and scored over 20 points last week, but that I don't think will translate to the Chargers, and the reason I'm saying that is because Harbaugh is a lot more of a running first coach. I think that they're going to get it done on the ground. The Panthers allowed the 6th most points to quarterbacks in week 1, 3 touchdowns to Derek Carr, like I said. But they also allowed the 2nd most points to running backs last week. He's going to pound the rock. He's going to run the ball. He's going to get it to Gus Edwards and J.K. Dobbins. They're going to see what they can do on the ground. Herbert won't have to pass the ball that much. I think that they'll win this game pretty handedly without needing much from Herbert. I still believe that the Panthers secondary is a decent squad, a very good squad. They showed that last year, and I don't think they got worse. For me, it's just a matter of him not needing to do that much, just kind of like Brock Purdy did last week, where of course, they're going to win the game. They have a very good team comparatively, but he doesn't need to do anything. And I think that that's going to be his downfall fantasy-wise. Bryce Young up next. Need I say more? He was horrible. He's been horrible since he came into the league. I don't know how much of it is his fault or how much of it is really Carolina just being a very bad football team. But we're going to still sit him here. The Chargers only allowed 10.78 points to Gardner Minshew in week 1. He threw 2 interceptions last week and only threw for 161 yards on 13 of 30 passes. He did add 1 rushing touchdown, which kind of skewed his total points last week. And he was just bad last year, He doesn't have the stats to really back it up. He was 29th in points per game, 10.4, 35th in points per dropback, 28th in passing touchdowns. He only threw for 11, and he played in, every single game last year. He's had 2 games as a top 16 fantasy quarterback. He's going to have to show some more consistency. I'm not going to start him ever until he can do that. So I'm going to keep him sat here. Up next, once again, got the guy that pretty much defeated me last week. By playing absolutely incredible, he was my worst take by far. And that's going to be Derek Carr. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to sit him again this week. He was the quarterback 6 last week. He threw 3 touchdowns, had no turnovers, and he's looking to build on a very successful end of season in 2023 where he just absolutely was lights out. But, despite those last couple of weeks, he was still only 22nd in fantasy points per game. He was 24th in fantasy points per dropback. The biggest thing here is Dallas only allowed 10.66 points in week 1 to quarterback Deshaun Watson. They forced 2 interceptions. They sacked Watson 6 times and forced 1 fumble. I think it's going to be similar. I think the Saints do have a chance of winning this game, but I do think that the Cowboys defense is going to absolutely get at Derek Carr. They're going to force him to make some difficult throws, and I think that could be problematic. I'm not going to take any chances here. I think that he definitely should be sat until we can see, how he can fare against these really, really tough defenses. Now, on the flip side, let's talk about Dak. One of my hottest takes last week was sitting Dak, and it was absolutely warranted. He played a very tough defense in Cleveland. I don't see him having the abysmal performance that he had last week, only getting 11 points. He didn't really have to do anything to win. They were scoring everywhere. They got a punt return for a touchdown. They were just kind of running the ball. Dak didn't have to do anything. They were up 27-3 at half. He only had to throw 11 times in the second half, and he threw for a total of 23 yards. I expect this to be a much more difficult game because, New Orleans' offense is not the same as Cleveland's offense, clearly. He just signed a $240 million extension. I expect him to build on that and continue to be the great fantasy quarterback that we know him to be. He was number 3 in fantasy last year. He just had an off week. I'm not too worried about it. I think he's going to bounce back for you guys. Up next, we have the Colts going to take on the Green Bay Packers. Anthony Richardson, number 4 quarterback in fantasy in week 1. He had 2 major deep ball touchdowns. One of them was one of the best throws in the entire NFL ever to exist. He added 56 yards on the ground. The Packers allowed the 10th most fantasy points to quarterbacks in week 1. Jalen Hurts threw for 2 touchdowns. He did throw 2 picks, but those were 2 awful picks, and we'll talk about those later. His rushing upside creates a very safe floor to continue to start Anthony Richardson. I think he should have plenty of opportunities because Malik Willis is going to be the starting quarterback. I don't think they're going to move the ball very well, and I think he should have those opportunities to really progress and, just score fantasy points, honestly. And up next, we have the guy who is so new to the Packers that I couldn't even find a good photo of him in a Packers uniform. Malik Willis. He's going to have to show us absolutely anything. He has started 3 games in his career for the Titans. He had 1 rushing touchdown to go with 3 interceptions and 234 total passing yards. He's not going to start in any format. I don't care how bad the Colts defense might be because, we saw CJ Stroud be successful against them. Malik Willis is not the same. He's only there because Jordan Love got hurt. I don't think he's even a serviceable backup quarterback in the actual NFL. So I'm absolutely not going to start him this week. Up next, we have the Browns going to Jacksonville to take on the Jaguars, and this was one where I don't need any stats to talk about how bad Deshaun Watson probably is. I don't think it's going to be very long before they try and go with somebody like Jameis Winston. This might be the worst contract in NFL history by a wide margin, especially because of his guaranteed money. He's just not been playing good. Ever since he left Houston, when he's been dealing with all the legal problems, he just added an additional, lawsuit to his resume back in Houston. He just hasn't felt like the same quarterback. He doesn't have the same swagger. He doesn't have the same confidence. He's just not the same guy. And, it's really affected his play. And not only that, it's affected everybody's fantasy performances. So I'm going to go ahead and sit him. He doesn't warrant any start in any format, and I'll leave it at that. Now, up next, we have Trevor Lawrence. I love Trevor Lawrence as a player. I really hope that he's successful in the NFL, but I'm going to sit him this week. The Browns allowed the third least points per game to quarterbacks in 2023 and held Dak Prescott to 11.36 points despite being absolutely obliterated in that game in week one. They have a good defense. The defense wins their games for them. You know, he did have 20 points versus Cleveland last year, but he threw 3 interceptions to go along with his 3 touchdowns. He's struggled versus very good defenses, and that showed last year. He had 9.2 versus Kansas City, 4.1 versus San Francisco, only 14.7 against Baltimore, and 15.7 against Pitt. These were outside of the top 16, and, you know, going up against a very good defense once again, I'm just not going to start him. I think that there's a good chance that it becomes a bloodbath and he just keeps getting hit and hit. And when Lawrence gets hit, he's just going to be making those same mistakes. So we're going to go ahead, keep him on the bench. All right, so this is the Jets going on against the Titans. This is my favorite one so far. I'm not going to say anything about Will Levis. I'm just going to show you this clip, and I'm going to leave it at that.
Gordon's coming. Levis gets wrapped up. Flinks it ahead.
Yeah, so that's all I'm going to say about that one. Up next, you know, the Jets, we got Aaron Rodgers. He did only score 8.58 points versus San Francisco in week one. And Tennessee only allowed 7.22 points to Caleb Williams in week one, but Aaron Rodgers is still Aaron Rodgers. Tennessee's defense is still not amazing despite the fact that they held Caleb Williams to that. You know, maybe the Bears just aren't that amazing. They only forced 6 interceptions in 2023. That was the least in the NFL. And Tennessee allowed the 6th highest passer rate in 2023. I expect a bounce back here. Aaron Rodgers, you know, getting that rust off versus San Francisco, a very tough defense. I expect him to perform a lot better and probably throw for a couple of tutties versus the Titans. Buccaneers versus Lions are up next, and do not sleep on this man, Baker Mayfield. I told you guys during the offseason that he was probably going to be a league winner this year. I think he's putting on a show this year, and he proved that last week. He was the second top quarterback in week one behind, obviously, Josh Allen. 25 points versus Detroit in the playoffs last year. He's been cooking. I still think Detroit has a bad secondary. I'm not convinced that they're good despite how well they held Matthew Stafford last week. And it's because they showed the 3rd most points per game to quarterbacks in 2023. After week 6 in 2023, Baker was QB 17 or worse only 3 times. He was cooking. And he's getting the ball to his top playmakers. Chris Godwin moved back to the slot and showed what he can do with 8 catches and 83 yards. I expect Baker to just build on his performances. I think he's going to be a fantasy asset this year, and I expect him to continue his greatness this week. Up next, we have Jared Goff from the same game. I expect him to bounce back. The Bucs allowed the 7th most points per game to quarterbacks in 2023 and the 3rd most points to a quarterback in week 1. I know that a lot of those points were in garbage time, but I think it is relevant. I do think they have Antoine Winfield Jr., who is absolutely phenomenal, but I do think their secondary needs a lot of help, and Jared Goff has a lot of weapons. He only put up 11 points in week 1, but he was the quarterback 7 overall in 2023. He has too many weapons for them not to succeed. I'm thinking they're going to get St. Brown and Laporta a lot more involved this season. This game. And Goff put up 22 and 20 points versus the Bucs last year. I think he's going to do the same thing. I expect him to have a major comeback this week and, really lead your fantasy teams to some wins. Gardner Minshew up next as the Raiders are going to take on the Ravens. The Ravens held Patrick Mahomes to 15 points last week. I'm just going to put that out there. We all know how great Mahomes is. And to put a guy like Mahomes out there and hold him to just 15 points for fantasy relevance, that's pretty dang good. The Chargers limited Minshew to 10 points himself last week, and he scored only 13 points versus Baltimore last year. They're still kind of figuring out what's working for their offense. This is a very mediocre Raiders team. They have a young head coach who is still trying to figure out what's working. And when we look at the stats, the Ravens had 2 sacks, 7 quarterback hits, and 3 pressures on the Chiefs last week, and that's against a pretty good offensive line, I would say. And comparatively, Chargers on the Raiders got 4 sacks and 22 generated pressures. I think that the Ravens are really going to get after it, and Gardner Minshew is going to have a lot of trouble, so I'm going to go ahead and sit him for this week. And we have Lamar Jackson. Now, this is a guy that I also didn't really feel the need to type or look up any research for too crazily. Because he's Lamar Jackson. He ran for 122 yards on the ground last week versus the Chiefs. So if Max Crosby can get to him, which I'm sure that he will be able to because the Ravens O-line is fairly yikes, I think he'll still be able to escape and, do what he does with his legs. I don't anticipate he'll have less than 20 points this week, and if he does, it won't be by much. It'll probably be 18-19, which is still a justifiable start. So I would go ahead, you're not going to sit him, just go ahead, lock him into that starting position. Up next, we have a divisional matchup in the NFC West. The Rams going on to take on the Cardinals, and Matthew Stafford for me is going to be a start. Last week, he was the quarterback 13 with 317 passing yards and 1 touchdown and 1 interception. The Cardinals did allow 31 points to quarterbacks in week 1. Granted, that was Josh Allen, but it shows that their defense is kind of soft. And Stafford last year versus Arizona, he was the quarterback 15, 1 touchdown, 226 passing yards, and the QB 7 with 4 touchdowns and 1 interception with 229 passing yards. He's only had 1 performance versus Arizona worse than QB 16 since 2019, and it looks like he's finally found that rhythm with Cooper Kupp again, especially because Puka Nacua is going to be out for the foreseeable future. So expect Cooper Kupp and Matthew Stafford to cook this week. I'm going to go ahead, lock him in for a start. Kyler is up next in the same game, and we're going to go ahead and start him again as well. He has had 2 games of QB 17 or worse since returning. He's been lights out for most of the end of last season, and he didn't play exactly great despite putting up 28 points last week, but he was still the quarterback 15. Despite only throwing for 162 yards, he did add 56 on the ground and a rush touchdown. I do expect the lack of passing yards he can make up for on the ground, which end up being a lot more points, and that's why I asked you guys to pick him up in the drafts before this season started. The Rams, they're dealing with a bunch of injuries. I expect Kyler to be able to, do his thing and get it done at least in the top 16 of quarterbacks. I'm not going to sit him. I'm absolutely going to pound the start here. Up next, we have the Bengals and the Chiefs. Probably going to be one of the best games of the week, I would hope at least, because the Bengals and Chiefs are always up there with the Chiefs and Bills. I'm going to go ahead and start Joe Burrow against my better judgment here. I know there's some injury concerns with his wrist, and there's a lot of videos going out about his wrist. I even saw him flexing it, kind of, maneuvering it around, showing that there is some discomfort there. However, Burrow kind of stat pads versus Kansas City. In the 4 games he's played, he's been under 16 points once, and it was in the AFC Championship in his most recent AFC Championship appearance. So, he played bad that game, but he usually plays really well against the Chiefs. It's like the competition brings out the best in him. He has the weapons. He, last week he was 9th in clean pocket completion percentage. He did very well, 27th in pressured completion percentage, which shows that his offensive line just needs to be better. On top of that, he was out T. Higgins and his wide receivers and tight end 32nd in receiver target separation, so they weren't very much getting open. I don't know if that's more on the receivers or more on the Patriots defense, but I do expect him to not have such a bad game this week. I think he bounces back. Up next, we have Mr. Mahomes. We're all going to start him. He was the quarterback 10 in fantasy points per game last year, 8th in passing touchdowns. He potentially has a top wide receiver room in the league again. Still has Kelsey there, added Hollywood Brown, who hasn't quite gotten to play. Rashee Rice looked amazing. Xavier Worthy looked like he had a lot of potential. This isn't the same wide receiver room that we saw last year with Kadarius Toney and those guys. This is a much improved wide receiver room. He is that guy, unfortunately, I know. Last week, he did score 9th in fantasy points per dropback, and he was the quarterback 12 versus a very tough defense in Baltimore. I don't think the Cincinnati defense will give him the same run for his money. He's a very safe start here for me. 3 games left here as we've got the Steelers taking on the Broncos. In Justin Fields, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start him. The Broncos gave up 18 points to Geno Smith. That's the 9th most in week 1. He did carry the ball 14 times in week 1 for 57 yards. I think he should have a field day versus the Broncos. He should be able to run all over them, even if they don't win the game or aren't as successful on offense. I don't think that it should be difficult. He did show some, poise with the Steelers last week against a very tough defense. They didn't score offensively last week, and that is a major concern, but I think Fields' rushing upside and the Broncos' lack thereof of defense, I think it should be a very viable option for you. So I'm going to go ahead and lock in that start. And in the same breath, I told you last week that I was going to need to see something from Bo Nix in order to start him, and I did not quite see that. Bo Nix threw 2 interceptions last week, made some very big mistakes. Obviously, he's a rookie quarterback. He has a lot to learn. He did add 1 rushing touchdown on the ground to score 11 points, but, it's not going to be easy this week. The Steelers kept Kirk Cousins to 6.20 points and forced 3 turnovers. It's going to be very difficult. I expect the Steelers to overwhelm him. This should be an easy under for anything and everything. I'm going to lock in sitting him this week. Sunday Night Football, we have the Bears going on to take on the Texans. I started Caleb last week, and I did not like what I saw. Normally, I am very much against the rookie quarterbacks and, starting them, feeling any type of way toward them. I made the exception for Jayden Daniels and Caleb Williams. Jayden Daniels performed very well. Caleb Williams did not. The offense looked very shaky. I'm going to go ahead and sit him here. He only scored 7.22 points in week 1. It's less about the talent that he has and more about maneuvering through the offense, showing us what he can do. On top of that, now he's got an injured receiver core. I saw Keenan Allen hobble off after an attempted touchdown pass. Rome Odunze is dealing with an injury. They scored 0 offensive touchdowns last week. They were unable to move the ball at all. They had 93 total passing yards against the Titans. This is, something where he's going to have to now show it in order for me to warrant starting him, and I just don't see it yet. He's gonna have to do something. First of all, just score a touchdown, please. CJ Stroud is up next, and I'm sure we all know that this is a start. Quarterback 7 in week 1, very good performance against the Colts. Joe Mixon, kind of took away from a lot of the fantasy points that he could have produced by rushing for over 150 yards. But it is what it is. He has only thrown 3 interceptions since joining the league last year. and he had played pretty good last week. He was 4th in true passer rating, 9th in total quarterback rating, 10th in fantasy points per dropback. He has the best wide receiver core, in my opinion, in the entire NFL, and I know that, some people might disagree. I think that his core is absolutely great. I don't think he can be set. I think he's going against a Bears team that's still trying to figure it out, and I think he should have plenty of opportunities to score some touchdowns here. I'm going to go ahead, lock in the start, and I've already put him in all of my lineups. Last but not least, we have the Monday Night Football game between the Falcons and the Eagles. I'm going to go ahead and start Kirk Cousins despite what issues they had last week versus the Steelers. I'm not going to hold that against him. The Steelers are a very tough defensive unit, and you know what? I'm sure that most quarterbacks would have been disgruntled by them and, kind of performed badly. So Philadelphia, they allowed the 11th most fantasy points to quarterbacks in week 1, allowed 2 touchdowns to Jordan Love. I still think that this Philadelphia secondary is suspect. They allowed the 7th most passing yards in week 1 as well. And I think this is a bounce back game for Kirk. There's tons of offensive weapons like Drake London and Kyle Pitts and even Darnell Mooney, Bijan in this offense. They have a very good run defense as well. The Eagles do. So that being said, the Eagles, they're going to force the Falcons to throw the ball a lot more. I think Kirk Cousins should have plenty of opportunities to sling it and take advantage of this, and it should result in probably 2 touchdowns, 250 yards. I think he goes for 17, 18 points, just like we know Kirk Cousins to do. I think it's going to be a good week for him. And last but not least, we have Jalen Hurts. Now, Jalen Hurts I'm going to start him for the simple fact that he can use his legs and he's going to possibly get a rushing touchdown behind that offensive line. I still think that the Falcons' pass D is elite, and Hurts showed some, question marks, some very bad passes during that game against Green Bay. His turnovers were horrible. The interceptions looked bad. They didn't look like a poised quarterback. They looked like he was just kind of throwing the ball to his receiver, focusing on his one read, and that was it, because he threw into like double and triple coverage. It wasn't like a jump ball that just corner made a play or anything like that. They were just bad plays. He did throw for 2 touchdowns, though, and 278 passing yards, with adding 33 rushing yards on the ground. The Falcons, they allowed 57 rush yards to Justin Fields in week 1. I do expect that he's going to have to use his legs this week a lot more in order to, push the ball when it needs to be pushed. And I think that his rushing upside makes him a can't sit. So I'm going to go ahead and lock in his start. Go ahead, push that in for me. And that's going to be it, guys. I'm recording this video at 2:30 in the morning, so I wanted to make sure that I got at least this one out to you guys before kickoff today. So if you guys like this video and you guys want to see more like it, I would be so grateful if you guys subscribed, comment if you're new here, like the video, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Peace.